Right, so I'm Daniel Champlin. I'm speaking mostly about what I did up in Aberdeenshire, which I was at up until a year ago working with Sylvia, but also a little bit about my work in Falkirk, where I've been since coming down to the Central Belt, maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle from a lot of you, being a class teacher and trying to motivate and get things going on the ground, I suppose, within a primary school setting, rather than just purely council-wide initiatives and that sort of thing. So I suppose my background is quite similar to all of you in that we all know about the benefit of learning languages. We know it can help with the native language, we know it can help with problem solving, general health and well-being, and of course as well in terms of meeting the wider Scottish goals in terms of attainment, the gap, closing the gap, and also making links to developing the young workforce in terms of skills for life, skills for work, and the 1+2 policy as well that all schools are probably at this stage implementing or trying to implement before the deadline. But as all of you will know, and certainly I have come across in my own schools that I have been in, there's not particularly any high requirements in terms of teacher knowledge to get onto whether it's the B.Ed or MA or PGDE. And so a lot of teachers either don't have the knowledge or the confidence to teach it, or it ends up being one of these things where with such a focus on literacy, such a focus on numeracy, and also health and well-being, that it's one of those that's easy for most people to forget or leave for the end of the day when you run out of time and you don't actually get around to doing it. Or if you do, you do just the register every morning and you consider that to be your 1+2 exercise for the term and then the year and then the entire primary school career. So when I came into Aberdeenshire in my second year teaching after I got the job, I found out about our languages ambassador program from each school. I asked my head teacher if I could go on it, and it was just before one of the Erasmus deadlines, and Sylvia had mentioned that next week was the deadline for the immersion courses. Probably not enough time for anyone to do anything about it now, but if you know, maybe next year or something fancy, the free trip to France, then why not go for it? Took that on as a challenge at the time, and I was like, right, I have this weekend to get this done. So I spoke to my head teacher, and at the time my school didn't particularly care much for modern languages. We weren't doing it in the classes, we weren't really focusing on it as a cluster particularly much or anything school-wide. And so I kind of tried to approach it almost as a, look, free trip, and invited, I said to my head teacher, I'll apply, you can come with me, and let's see what this is like. So we got the funding for that first year, and it was myself, the deputy head teacher at the time, and the head teacher. We all went on the first French immersion course that summer. So that kind of snowballed into realizing just the potential that languages has, not just for the children in terms of opportunities for 1+2, but also in terms of what it could contribute around the school in general in terms of the children's learning, attainment, and equity. That was one of the main things that we saw, because none of them had done it before. There wasn't so much of the same, oh, this person's in the top group, this person's in the bottom group. Everyone was starting fresh, and some of the children that hadn't necessarily excelled in other parts of the curriculum found an opportunity for them to do so in this part of the curriculum. Following this, we essentially took the opportunity to justify having gotten the funding by implementing lots of different policies across the school that I was at in Aberdeenshire, and we applied for further funding for other teachers to go to the courses to hopefully spread the news. So I was doing quite a bit in my own class with supportive management. We started putting and implementing things into the improvement planning for the school, but we still had the issue of teachers not necessarily wanting to take this on themselves. In my mind, I had one teacher in particular, a fellow P3 teacher at the time, who had done P3 for the last 20 years and was very set in her ways about how it should be done. And of course, French was not to touch her classroom in any sort of way. So that was kind of one of the goals, to see if someone like that could be engaged into teaching 1+2. Following that first year, we tried to get the teachers involved in lots of different activities to get them excited for teaching French and seeing how many people we could actually get going to the courses. So after that, with all the new development and all the cultural resources and everything that we were getting from the council as well via Sylvia for all the promotion of languages, that kind of gave it a boost, and we had 8 teachers going the following year. The benefit of that was that we were having people from early level first and second, so you kind of had then representatives from across the school that could promote it to their stage partners and kind of create almost a fear of missing out type of environment in the school, since if your stage partner is doing all these grand songs and little plays, then maybe you should catch on as well and do that. And so we were getting a little bit of involvement from everybody, both for the original courses, the follow-up courses, and as well for the ones that simply weren't able to go for whatever reasons. We were then trying to get them involved either with the PowerLanguage online course, but also the cluster-wide courses that were being run by Aberdeenshire at the time at schools nearby in connection with the high school teachers and secondaries in those places. So we had the vast majority of our school within just about a year going from not particularly bothered at all by French to either having been on one of these courses in person, abroad, or online, and doing different levels of French. We then set off to promote L3 as well. So it's kind of like an early implementation. So I came out of class in the second year to teach Spanish part-time, I suppose, while having my own class as well as an L3 introduction within the council, while the teachers themselves were embedding the L2. This was some of the feedback that we got after the second year from the teachers. A lot of these teachers, I will admit, went a lot because I promoted it as there being lots of wine and all these other nice activities. So they were kind of seeing it as a free holiday in their mind. But every single one of them agreed that they had learned and picked up so much out of it. So they maybe went with different intentions in their mind, but then they came back with a lot to contribute back to their own classes and back to the school. So it was pretty much unanimous from all of them in terms of the benefit of the courses for themselves, their own knowledge, opportunities to work with other people, work within the school, work across Scotland with other professionals, and also in terms of what they could actually use in the classroom for teaching modern languages. A lot of them were maybe not necessarily positive about modern languages before going on the courses, whether it was the immersion courses or the ones more locally, but then they came back really willing to give it a try at least. And the fact that we were moving in that direction as a school really helped to promote that across the board. And that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to replicate just now in my current school in Falkirk. We have a bunch of staff members who will also be going over the next few months on the immersion courses. And I'm currently also teaching the L3, which is Spanish as well. So as mentioned, in terms of confidence and strategies, it became really quite embedded across the school. We also tried to focus a lot on cultural experiences. Up in Aberdeenshire, my school went into a new building, and so we had a big celebration day for the opening of the new building, and even languages factored into that, with the children learning songs and dialogues and introducing the new school in French. With all the shared resources and helping teachers with that, it just made it that little bit easier to spread it, not just in terms of the school itself, but also across the cluster in terms of cluster-wide resources, sharing the PowerLanguage platform, for example, within the entire cluster, and then also running trainings, for example, with Sylvia, about how to apply for the immersion funding that other schools could access and replicate the same sort of experience that we had in their own schools. As mentioned with L3, I came out of class to do it as a non-contact. In Falkirk, in my current school, we've had the luck, I suppose, that this year we have more staff than we necessarily need, which means that I've been able to actually teach L3 together with the class teachers. So I'm going into P5, 6, and 7 teaching, and also hopefully trying to teach the class teacher as well, not just the basic language of Spanish, but also showing some of the games and ideas. It's only a half an hour slot to get around to all the classes, but then it's with a hope that once they pick up these skills and ideas, they can continue for another half hour or something like that on a different day and do a little bit of that with their own classes as well. So it's kind of a team teaching modeling approach, which is working quite well, especially for the teachers that either don't have any Spanish themselves or aren't particularly confident in teaching modern languages in general. One of the big things that we saw was quite beneficial in Aberdeenshire, which we're now trying to do here as well, is getting not just the teachers and the school behind the initiatives, but also the whole wider community and families. So up in Aberdeenshire, we launched, together with Sylvia and the head teacher, suggested the PowerLanguage home course after we saw it here 2 years ago when it was first being rolled out. And so we did it as a trial for one level, so P4 trial at my school, and I launched it at the 2 parents' evenings to see how many parents we could get involved and signed up for it, and 60% of all the P4 families went for it. So the engagement was quite high, the children are really quite excited for it. In Falkirk, it's been slightly different in that each school has been given 30 accounts, which we've rolled out from P3 up to P7, and as it stands, we've nearly filled all 30 of our accounts. The high engagement has been quite good. The main challenge has actually been in getting the ones that are not particularly confident signing up for it. One thing that I noticed that was quite interesting from the Falkirk perspective, where we launched it across the school, was that a very large percentage of the ones that have signed up, and obviously 28 is maybe not necessarily a huge sample size, but a very large number of those were children that are EAL. So the ones that already have experience of learning a foreign language themselves, English being their second language, a lot of them are not afraid of doing it. And so about half of those came from EAL children. So I think the challenge here is then how do we break that barrier of the ones that don't feel confident with doing it in the first place. But that could also come from the parents as well. If the parents aren't particularly wanting to get engaged, or if they feel afraid of modern languages, EAL parents that have already been through that experience themselves, coming to this country and learning English themselves, then obviously they probably wouldn't be as afraid with that one either. In terms of getting the children on board, to going beyond just simply we have a new subject to learn in class, we really tried to focus on getting the whole school involved in as much as we can. So in terms of cultural activities, we were running lots of assemblies where even if it was just a normal assembly, we'd maybe finish off with a French song. We were doing the Euro quiz, the European Day of Languages, trying to get every class to do a little bit with that. At my current school in Falkirk, we are going to have a couple clubs going, so a lunchtime club for any child that's wanting to get involved, and then also a citizenship group where children sign up for a club within the school times, and then they get to do a little bit of leadership, for example, going into different classes and teaching a little bit of French or a little bit of Spanish to the younger classes, kind of like an ambassador model. Also, in terms of resources and activities, games and songs, puppets, anything like that we could think of to try to get them engaged a little bit more. A lot of the things that other people have been presenting about and speaking about today, things that they hadn't come across before, has been really good for getting them engaged as well. So we have been doing it with even very early years. The really great thing that I found up in Aberdeenshire when I was doing it across the school was that the younger you get them, the more willing they are to engage with it. And so I found it much easier to teach it, even though they might not necessarily have the other skills, to actually go into the earlier stages and get them started there. And so I think that will be one of the key challenges in making sure that everybody is getting a bit of language teaching right from the beginning, whether it's P1 or nursery, so that they have that interest and they're not afraid of it as it gets a little bit more difficult and writing and all these other aspects are introduced as they get a little bit older. So we tried in the earlier years to do lots of activities connected to art and craft and culture, holidays, all these sort of things to embed languages through things that they already knew, through cultural activities, and just get the French in there as often as we could. So for example, things like cutting and gluing and matching for things related to Christmas at Christmas time, and then also linking it to other things that could be quite fun. So, and not just Spain, not just France. So when I was coming out of class to do Spanish, for example, of course we did look at some of the Christmas traditions in Spain, but then we also looked at things like the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico and getting them involved in, creating the masks and looking at artwork and all these other aspects as well. So giving them the perspective that there's also so many places that have all these different traditions that you can connect to the language as well and go beyond just simply Spain and go beyond just simply France when you're working with cultural aspects. So a few of the other things that we did to try to take it beyond the school. So as I mentioned, we did some cluster in-service training about resources and also the whole school training. In Falkirk, we are launching Spanish together with Laura at our cluster in the springtime at the in-service event, and also there's a lot of work going on with development groups at cluster-wide level, sharing resources, ideas, and trying to get all the schools involved in the 1+2 work. In terms of challenges that I've certainly come across anyway, cost considerations when there's a big blast of a budget and you can get things like the home language course and other things, but then as an example in Falkirk with 30 accounts, but what happens when you hit the 30, continuing that, for example, other resources. And the big one in terms of staff changing, even as an example with myself, when I came out of class in Aberdeenshire to teach Spanish, what then happens afterwards when I left, I know that now they're teaching German in that school. So it's how you deal with staffing changes both within with a school when someone moves away from a school, but also within a school. So things, for example, with the P1 teacher who has taught P1 for several years suddenly being put in P7, where the language demand will be much bigger. How do you juggle that? And also for P5, P6, P7 teachers, if you don't have the luxury of having somebody with a language skill to come into your class, whether it's non-contact or not, how you can get them trained up and feeling confident to teach not just one language, but 2 languages in those stages. And also then, of course, the tracking and progression in terms of having a filled curriculum where the focus is so high on other aspects. Right, well, thank you very much. So this was just a nice little example that we had not too long ago with a learning log. This was in a P3 class. So it was a boy that I had who really found it difficult and wasn't particularly engaged, but it didn't take more than a couple of months for him to really start getting into it. And so he was always the one that was going home and sharing a bit of language with his mum, and then coming back and showing what he'd done over the weekend, and always trying to get a little bit more involved. So I think that's the importance of when you cross those barriers with the teachers, the kids come along for the ride eventually, and then as they get more engaged and more confident with it, adding on a L3 and developing into higher skills doesn't necessarily have to be a huge challenge.
Can you read it to us?
It says, I found French to be tricky. I want to be better at French, and I would like to do more French.
No, but it's a bit far away.
It was a hand
Okay. Thank you very much.